So like the subject is simply a way of embodying failure. It's a way like you fail to do this, the subject is there to almost symbolize this failure as its own premise, its own form of enjoyment. Because and this is still the problem with if you read Mark Solms, it's very, very clear. But even in Lacanian neuropsychoanalysts, which is that it still reduces pleasure to something on the level of need, of this this basic homeostatic argument that if you tend away from perfect biological harmony, you feel unpleasure, then you tend to walk back towards it, you feel pleasure. But this isn't if there's one thing that psychoanalysis insists, it's that pleasure, and specifically enjoyment, is often directly opposed to your Darwinian biological self-interest. Why would you have fetishisms and masochistic, violent masochistic sexual desires if what you're really there for is to have the homeostatic need to drink water, reproduce, eat a meal? Why would you enjoy, almost on an ideological sense, yes, things like asceticism, but also like these strange sexual encounters where the goal of sexuality is postponed endlessly? Like the actual reason you have a sexual relation shows that is postponed. What you have is the continual reproduction of the absence of any sexual relation. You focus on the fetish object. So like human practices, generally ideological, sexual, personal practices, if they show anything, is that enjoyment rejects pleasure. It rejects the basic biological model of survival as pleasurable, homeostatic pleasure. And yet the neuropsychoanalysts insist on it. They tend to insist on, but here's again where you can play with it in a neuropsychoanalytic, in the neurological sense, which is that if the brain does anything, to me, it does many things, but if like memory, take memory for example, if we've seen one thing is that the memory structures of the brain, including the hippocampus, the neocortex, etc., are unfaithful to actual events. They constantly rework each other according to new subjective priorities. It's not creating a faithful representation of the world as it is. It's in fact reworking the world according to strange priorities. And often these priorities can, whatever it can be, they're often very far from survival. You remember a passing glance of a person that you saw on the subway one day, and then suddenly you're totally dissatisfied with any sexual relation. Like memory often can be very counterproductive. It can act against any faithful reproduction of reality and against the basic, survivalist drive: reproduce, have sex, whatever, eat, drink. Sometimes, your memory can be so counterintuitive, counterproductive, that it directly intervenes, like, against these things. And here's and this to me is, for example, where it should be going, which is to notice that there are these strange enigmas and paradoxes where for example, the basic premise of psychoanalysis that we're not natural, like we're not natural creatures. We're these strangely self-contradictory cultural avatars of failure, of perverse forms of enjoyment. Even the most intimate experience of the self, of my own personality, is conditioned or is guaranteed by the other. It's ideologically structured, etc. Like these are there's no natural experience in things like this. We're not natural creatures. And on the face of it, you'd think, oh, well, that throws neuroscience out the window because neuroscience looks at nature. No, because even neuroscience throws nature out of the window at a certain point, which says that our memory is simulacral. It reconstructs itself. We operate against biological Darwinian survival. We have strange new priorities once we have a neocortex that directly have a top-down reconfiguration of the earlier, more natural, basic brain structures. So neuroscience itself could reach the same conclusion that we're unnatural. Like the basic human project is unnatural. But instead, it's taken this strange tendency to go, no, pleasure is still, enjoyment is just a reflection of survival. But this clearly isn't the case for psychoanalysis, and my argument would be it's not the case for neuroscience anymore either, or at least you could push it in that way. We have these strange top-down, perplexing paradoxes that the brain does, which are not faithful to our survival, to a faithful representation of reality. They introduce something different that I think can be used to argue that we're not natural creatures. Our enjoyment is in direct contradiction to pleasure, blah, 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 and so on. I mean, does that make some sense?
But also, as you mentioned in your piece, and I think I was going to ask you about this for you to flesh it out, but I feel like you've already at least intimated the arguments you made in your piece, the enjoyment of failure, a critique of Mark Solms, this Substack piece, where, of course, you talk about the death drive, and we know that, in fact, for me, I get this wrong. Please go ahead. Yeah, I mean, I get this point from Todd.
I'll let you finish, but that's the other point. The Lacanian neuroscientists don't respect the death drive. The death drive is its own thing, and that's very important, even for Lacan. Sorry, that was just a brief interruption.
No, that is in fact quite important, because I had a question on the death drive too. In fact, the last question, and what I was trying to get at here was this. Todd McGovern says one reason psychoanalysis will never really be truly integrated into an institution like a university or a clinic, in a way it has to always break down, is because, well, it speaks of the death drive, it speaks of the unconscious, and the unconscious is something really obscene and ugly, and you can't really institutionalize it like any other field, and that's kind of really what Freud discovered in the Beyond the Pleasure Principle. But look, Rafael, there's a lot here, and I think we need to, in the interest of time, I need to keep my questions succinct and precise. Look, in that piece I was mentioning, your piece, A Critique of Mark Solms, you do say that the project of neuropsychoanalysis is still a worthwhile project. So, if we take something like what the Ljubljana school tried to do in philosophy, trying to bring into dialogue Lacanian psychoanalysis out of the clinic into sociology, critical theory, and philosophy, gymnasialism, really, that was, I'd say, probably one of the most fruitful projects in philosophy in our time. Really, it's been unbelievable. It's, frankly, for me as like an outsider, it's changed my life reading those books, right? So, I mean, I personally, as a very scientifically oriented thinker, like, I can't help myself, I think through the concepts of science, really. I'm seeing how can we save neuropsychoanalysis. So, for instance, when I came across John Dall'Aglio's work, I was, overjoyed. I was like, amazing. There's a Lacanian dealing critically with neuropsychoanalysis. So, if, again, for the listener, if you could probably, perhaps, yes, even steal, I wouldn't even say steal, man, but genuinely try and see what's there to save in neuropsychoanalysis, while at the same time in this piece, perhaps in like a succinct way, outline your critique of Mark Solms, specifically as he has developed this field so far, and where you think the field can go.
Well, I think, yes, two parts. I mean, I think to rescue the field, you take like most working neuroscientists today, you lock them up, you remove their rights to write anything, and you leave like a few faithful guys behind who can rescue it. No, I'm joking.
I concur. We'll work on that together.
Yeah. Yes. I can think of some nice prisons down in like southern England or something that will. No, but my problem with Mark Solms is several things, and it extends, in fact, beyond neuroscience. Unfortunately, I'm sure he's a very nice guy, and he's obviously a very intelligent guy. I don't know why he was made responsible for the translation of the standard edition, the new standard edition of the complete works of Freud. as someone who as a reader of Freud, I'm sorry, but he's very rudimentary as a reader of Freud. He makes James Strachey, and James Strachey himself butchered Freud in his famous translations of him. He makes James Strachey seem like a nuanced kind of dialectical reader of Freud. He sees Freud as he views Freud through the simple kind of drive mechanism, the kind of drive structure that we do things we don't want, we stay away from other things we don't want. He essentially fundamentally rejects things like the death drive. But really, also, I mean, he makes some very interesting arguments in. I can't remember the name of the book now. It's the Hidden Spring, the journey to the source of consciousness.
His recent book. Yeah.
Yes, he makes this argument at one point where he uses David Chalmers, interestingly, and David Chalmers is quite an interesting analytic philosopher, and he also and Friston's free principle,
free energy principle, yeah, active inference and free energy principle, yeah.
And he uses these, but makes a strange argument. Says like, well, how can, and it's his way of solving the hard problem of consciousness, and he argues that he looks firstly at the argument of how David Chalmers solves it, which is that, well, information essentially is never just information. Like any informational unit that is transmitted has this almost internal premise that it is information only once it's registered externally. So it's the inner kind of essence, let's say, or the core of a piece of information is external to the information itself. It's registered as information externally, and at that point becomes information. So because information always presupposes something for which it is information, then basically the mass scale build-up of, 150 billion neurons simply naturally produces a consciousness that would register its own informational processing. It's just there's no sudden skip to consciousness. And Mark Solms makes this very strange argument where he initially is very sympathetic to this. In an almost proto-Hegelian way, he says, like, yes, okay, fine, like the movement, like this slow construction of consciousness, I can't agree with, which is very Hegelian, because for Hegel, like, the subject is a rupture at a certain moment of time, like it's an achievement at a certain point, whereas, but he argues that, yes, but I agree that any component thing must be a thing insofar as it's a thing in relation to something else. Cola Rovelli, the popular scientist, makes the same thing when he tries to solve, he solves things like quantum superpositions by arguing that, well, all information is relational, so there is no thing that is superimposed onto another thing. It's a very strange argument, which also makes me laugh, because I think a lot of these popular scientists like to say, we're leagues ahead of whatever nonsense is going on in philosophy, and yet they seem to have just discovered French structuralism.
Not Rovelli, though. I would say he pays great debt to philosophy. I would defend him here.
Yes, that's true. That's very true. Yeah, he does. But in this kind of he does pay great debt to philosophy, but he likes Eastern philosophy. In this, like, I'm not opposed to what he says.
The mystical kind of philosophy. Yeah.
Yes, I'm not opposed to his conclusions. Well, I think his anti-essentialism is a bit. I don't totally agree with, but the argument that quantum structures are relational, yeah, of course. I mean, I have no problem with. I think that's an interesting argument, but it always, I don't know. It makes me laugh from the general discourse of neuroscientists quantum physicists that say, like, we're not doing nonsense here, but really, if you read it, then you go, well, look at this guy, Cola Rovelli. He's a French structuralist, but he's taken French structuralism to the level of quantum structures and quantum states, which isn't a problem. Anyway, the point I'm making is that Mark Solms here seems to adopt an almost proto-Hegelian perspective on information, like in consciousness and the constitution of consciousness, where there's no gradual buildup of consciousness, but information does somehow presuppose, like there is a gradual buildup, but in a different way, but consciousness does presuppose in the same way that there's a buildup of substance, for Hegel, but consciousness does information presupposes the thing for which it's information. But then he makes the argument that, well, we can't truly accept this in our solution because it would imply that consciousness, like that, it would imply some form of panpsychism, that even the smallest, like in amoeba or informational unit, is on some level conscious. And he goes, we can't admit that. So then he seems to return to a very kind of rudimentary notion of Freud, where we have certain adaptive capacities, homeostatic capacities, that simply become more and more and more complicated, and this adaptive, and I'm sure, yes, I'm not disagreeing with the argument that at a certain point in time, like, organisms existed to adapt to an environment, but humanity is not doing that, and you can't account for the perplexing modes in which consciousness expresses itself self-destructively and all of these things by countering its own logical priorities, by still appealing to the same evolutionary logic. It just doesn't work. It fundamentally obscures what the basic understandings of ideology since, yes, you go back to Hegel, it's there, but really, since the Frankfurt School, since Althusser and all of these people, you've missed, like, we're not evolutionary creatures anymore. And so that's a problem. Now, relating to, you're right, I do believe that neuroscience is neuropsychoanalysis is a very worthwhile field. I think it does something new. But to me, like, the thing that makes the most sense with it is, if you're going to talk about psychoanalysis, then I'm sorry, you need to talk about this, like, serious psychoanalysis, the ones that truly are able to engage with political structures, ideology, interpersonal, intersubjective relationships, romance, love, and even, because you need to ask what is the question that psychoanalysis asks. Psychoanalysis doesn't ask things like what is anxiety and happiness. Psychoanalysis asks what type of subject is capable of these things, which is a very different thing because it's an ontological question. It's also a phenomenological question, and it's tied to the subject, which is its own sadness, happiness, etc. And in order to answer these, the ones that are answering these questions are Lacan, to a certain extent Laplanche, a certain selective reading of Freud, and a few others. They're the ones that are answering it. So, yes, first of all, you stick with, like, you give whoever are the main figures of, you give all the main figures of neuropsychoanalysis a serious, like, they all have to go read Laplanche, first of all. Because Laplanche shows how to read. Like, Laplanche perfectly shows that Freud endlessly vulgarizes himself. He totally obscures his own discoveries. He's a complete idiot in relation to his own genius breakthroughs. So first of all, but then, so that would be the first, like, policy. Like, just go make them read Laplanche. But then the thing that's the most interesting to me, because then there are Lacanian neuropsychoanalysts, but they don't go far enough. They kind of dilute Lacan. And to me, it's not about finding what type of dynamic, like, cortical arrangements allow for symbolic experience. The symbolic is out there. Fine, we register it somehow, but the symbolic is something out there. And it's not about creating a Lacanian meta-neuropsychology. Like, that's not going to get us anywhere. In the same way, you can't locate the reversion of essence as the presupposition to its own becoming in the brain. Like, I'm sorry, it's not going to, like, the Hegelian doctrine in which being and nothing produces the very thing that is the presupposition for their existence. They produce essence, and yet essence is retroactively becomes posits itself as the presupposition to this being and nothing which produced essence. Strange paradoxical kind of like argument, the famous argument of a thing that posits its own presuppositions. I don't see where you're going to find this in the brain. So like my argument is that it's not about a kind of metapsychological perspective, neurometapsychological perspective, whatever. The argument for me, or at least for now, the thing that I think is worthwhile is to insist on these strange, perplexing contradictions or paradoxes where neuroscience is based, for example, on the notion that we are, surviving biological creatures, and yet neuroscience is capable of showing where things have gone awry in a certain sense, where the neurocortex suddenly becomes more important than more basic structures. In the same way, Hegel, Schelling, and even Lacan show that yes, of course, we have a natural origin. We come from nature through evolution, but at a certain point, like something retroactively is undone, and suddenly we're not operating according to the same. Like these strange paradoxes where a thing acts like beyond its own premises. Neuroscience is able to do this, and I think psychoanalysis and German idealists are doing it. But I don't know. No, it's very timid, and Dall'Aglio has. Sorry, yes, go ahead.
No, Dall'Aglio has. Please finish your thought.
He has this at the beginning of one of his. I wish I had the quote with me. At the beginning of one of his papers, he begins with exactly this, or a kind of prototype of this reasoning, and he says, what a neuropsychoanalysis should do, Lacanian neuropsychoanalysis, is not locate, the objectivity is, there, and the symbolic is there, and blah blah blah. Doesn't make sense. What is needed is a patu, as I call it, a non-all, a totality that is clearly open and doesn't contain itself, and to see where biology, where the brain goes in excess of its own, confinement. The extra brain thing within the brain, the thing within the brain that goes beyond the brain, in that sense. And I read that and I was like, totally, I completely agree here. Then the rest of the paper, goes on to, in essence, contradict and work against these two basic premises that he began with. So I'm like, obviously the push on a certain level is there, but it seems to undo itself instantly. And I'm like, first of all, localizing it, because even he locates the id in the upper brain stem, which he then says is the real. It's because it's non-representable. I'm sorry, the real is not affect. He seems to be implying the real is something akin to affect. It's not. The real is simply the impasse produced by the symbolic in relation to the symbolic itself. It doesn't pre-exist the symbolic, and it's nothing to do with affect. Well, it's to do with affect, but it's not affect. But like it's, I don't know, learning to, because he does it. You can see he does it, but he seems to be unwilling to follow his conclusion. Maybe he's been, courted by Mark Solms into, like, I don't know, into having some type of dialogue. But a truly, there are, of course, even in Mark Solms's work, plenty of things I agree with that are very good. But the what's important is being instantly obscured. It's like they're repeating Freud. They're going, these are our premises, and instantly forget about them. And if you're, it's about reading. To me, it's reading affinities. You begin with affinities. Like my argument in the failed interventions paper is simply that the multiple demands network, the multiple demands model of the frontal cortex, which shows that there is no seat of executive functioning. There is no portion of the frontal cortex that's responsible for this function or this function, for listening, for social tangos, whatever. No, it's that the frontal cortex itself is just radically contingent. It is its own use. Like there's no frontal cortex neuronal arrangement pre-existing whatever the arrangement is there in order to do. If it's like it is its own use beyond the thing it's used for, it simply is nothing. Like it's an abstract, not an abstraction, but it's a indeterminate kind of formless, mold. You know, the frontal so the argument that they make, that totally reworked the kind of earlier frontal cortex executive functioning research, is that all the frontal cortex is its use. Like all of the neuronal arrangements are totally radically contingent to their use and will entirely rework themselves the moment another task is there. Like there is no permanent set of and then I argued simply, well, this is where we get the Lacanian subject, because the Lacanian subject is nothing but the implication, its own implication within a signifying structure. It is its own use. There is no, like, it is totally divorced from its own agency. It's simply the guarantee by the other that speech functions. This is where we have the subject. It's a seal of approval almost. It's radically contingent to things that the subject cannot account for to the other. So again, well, I don't know. This was like a beginning to show that, because this is the thing that neuroscience, that psychoanalysis did with philosophy, which was there is no whole system in which somehow like all philosophical schools would come together under psychoanalysis, and we have a perfect understanding of a whole rational system. What psychoanalysis did was grant a certain validity to, for example, Schelling, Fichte, and Hegel, was to grant, by the logical methods that they deploy, show that they are fundamentally perfectly assimilable to subjective projects, to the paradoxes of self-consciousness and the unconscious. It's not, I used to have these arguments with Sebastian Gardner, the kind of, who was one, in my opinion, one of the great figures in reopening the case of psychoanalysis in relation to philosophy. But he used to say, I don't know why, in relation to Lacan, I don't know why you're doing this, because, well, there's no unconscious in Hegel's subject. And I said, no, but it's the method in which they deploy paradox, contingency, a certain logic. That's where it's worthwhile, at least for now,